Somewhere, in the vast, cold depths of the cosmos, there is a place devoid of mirth and merriment, an all-devouring black hole of comedy from whose event horizon no laughter may escape. I am, of course, talking about Boomer Humor. Okay, you can have another spin, but only 'cause it's your birthday. I didn't like the tone of your "I do." Lots of people say that married men live longer than single men. It's a ruddy lie. It only seems longer. She's doing all the driving. I'm just the one behind the wheel. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Let the nagging begin. Come, dear, whisper those 3 little words. Where's my supper? After 65 years, you still call Grandma darling, beautiful, and honey. What's the secret? I forgot her name 5 years ago, and I'm too scared to ask her what it is. Give a man a fish and he eats for a day. Teach him how to fish and he can avoid the wife for a whole weekend. Fast way to get fat. 8 letters. Marriage. If anyone objects to this union... Mrs. Holloway, I can't pull a plug to put him out of his misery. He's only got a broken arm. So there's this notion going around the internet and social media that the boomer generation has just one joke. Wife bad. Now, this is obviously a generalization. Not all boomer humor consists of jokes about how awful wedded life is. A lot of it also involves hating your children, wanting to see children get beaten, and acting as if there is no greater form of oppression than having to acknowledge the existence of other people or doing anything to keep the planet from becoming an uninhabitable wasteland. I mean, one day they're taking away your plastic straws, and the next they're sending you off to the gulag. That's how things work, right? But I think the reason this notion that all boomer humor is just wife bad resonates with people of a certain generation is because it's one of those things that just feels correct in the absence of any evidence to the contrary. Growing up in a boomer-dominated world, I received, shall we say, mixed signals when it came to women and relationships. As a boy, I was told that, sure, I might think girls are icky creatures with cooties now, but one day I would have a girlfriend. And this was treated like it would be an accomplished fact, not something I would actually have to put effort towards. Not getting a girlfriend was seen as a bit like not getting a job or not getting your driver's license. It was a sign that you had failed to achieve one of the expected milestones of adulthood. And while the travails and heartaches of being in love might be painful at times, it would all be worth it in the end. But then, something would happen. A terrible transformation would occur when the girlfriend became the wife. A fat, ugly, nagging shrew with no other purpose than to make your life miserable. Better turn in your man card now, bucko. With that ball and chain around your leg, all you have to look forward to is no sex and honey-do-less. Here are just some of the sentiments I've heard expressed about marriage over the years, some of which I've thoughtlessly repeated to others. Oh, so you're getting married? Well, from now on you'll only have to know 2 words. Yes, dear. Happy wife, happy life. There are 3 rings involved in marriage: the engagement ring, the wedding ring, and the suffer ring. I've been talking to some of the older guys, and they all agree that getting married just isn't worth it anymore. You'll wind up with some fat nagging bitch who's just going to divorce you and take half your stuff. What kind of guy would ever want that? Here's an exercise you can try. Put a penny in a jar every time you and your girlfriend have sex before marriage, and then take a penny out of it every time you have sex after marriage. I guarantee that jar will never be empty for as long as you live. If it flies, flows, or fucks, you're better off renting it. The sitcoms I watched on TV, whether it was Home Improvement or Married with Children or The Red Green Show, all suggested a rather antagonistic relationship between men and women. Wives were nagging killjoys who didn't want you to have fun and were someone you needed to get away from, while husbands were boorish cretins who couldn't keep house and who were constantly leaving the toilet seat up and forgetting their wives' anniversaries. Now, I was a dumb kid, but even I noticed that there seemed to be an inherent contradiction here. Why was romantic love, well, romanticized when the expected outcome, that is, marriage, was seen as something to be laughed at in a sort of I have to laugh because otherwise I'd cry way? A phrase I kept hearing was, a good marriage takes work, and I thought to myself, why would I ever want to be married then? Imagine coming home after 8 or 10 hours of work only to have to do more work. Again, I was just a kid, but that sounded like a raw deal to me. But before we dive deeper into this subject, we need to ask what exactly makes a joke work. You see, comedy is hard. It's one of the hardest genres to write well, and if you don't write it well, then the results are just excruciating. You can laugh at a bad movie that tries and fails at drama, but bad comedy is just unpleasant to sit through. And part of what makes comedy hard is that it's largely subjective. For a joke to land, there needs to be a shared context and understanding between the audience and the one telling the joke. But since the context of people's lives changes with when and where they live, the result is that humor usually doesn't travel very far in both time and space. This is why I'm always annoyed at hearing washed-up comedians like Jerry Seinfeld lamenting how you can't do comedy now because audiences are too woke or too politically correct or some other dim-witted buzzword. When someone says that you can't tell a joke anymore because of woke, what they really mean is, I'm out of touch with my audience and can't come up with material they'd find funny. And when I hear this sentiment, I always want to ask, what is this devastating comedy routine they want to perform but can't? Don't speak in hypotheticals, give me a concrete example. Do they even exist, or are you just making up fictional scenarios and then getting mad about them? Here's an example of comedy that hasn't aged well. In the Looney Tunes episode Falling Hair, released in 1943, Bugs Bunny is on a plane that's hurtling towards the ground. Suddenly, the plane sputters and comes to a halt midair, having run out of fuel. Bugs then says this.
Yeah, you know how it is with these A-cards.
Did you laugh at this joke? Likely not, and you were probably wondering, what the hell is an A-card? Well, during World War II, the United States implemented a gasoline rationing program, and ration cards were divided into lettered categories depending on how much gas one was allowed to purchase. An A card, issued to the general public, had the lowest priority, allowing one to obtain about 11 to 15 liters per week, while a B card, issued to workers in the defense industry, allowed the holder to purchase up to 30 liters a week. And then there was the mythical X card that granted the holder unlimited access to fuel. But if you grew up after World War II, then this joke is now incomprehensible. And even if you knew about the gasoline rationing program, it's still not really funny because you don't have that lived experience of the frustration it often caused. That was humor that didn't travel in time, so here's some humor that doesn't travel in place. This is a brief comedy sketch that I stumbled upon on YouTube, presented without context. 4 cars arrive at an intersection, and then this happens.
بابا بفرمایید دیگه.
No, you go first. Okay, you go. Come on.
بفرمایید عزیزم. قربون شما بریم.
So, what's the joke? Why are these people trying to get everyone else to go first? Well, this sketch is satirizing a concept in Persian culture called tarof. Now, this is a subject far beyond the scope of this video, but basically, tarof is a form of politeness that has been described as getting the lower hand, or subordinating one's own wishes and desires to that of a guest or another individual. For example, if you were to approach a door at the same time as another person, tarof would demand that you let them go first, except that it would also make the same demand of the other person, so who goes first? And that's what's happening here. 4 cars arrive at an intersection simultaneously, and tarof demands that each driver let the other go first, but since they can't all go first, it just escalates into an argument.
We gotta stop in an intersection. Reports say 4 Persians are tarofing. Tarofing?
Now, even being familiar with the concept of tarof, this sketch doesn't really resonate with me because I don't live in a culture that practices it. Here's another personal example. In 2002, the film My Big Fat Greek Wedding was taking cinemas by storm. It was a small, independent production with little in the way of star power, and yet somehow this movie was immensely successful. It was so popular, in fact, that when my family made several attempts to go see it, we discovered that each time the movie was completely sold out in every single theater. And when we finally did get a chance to watch it, I was just baffled. I could not for the life of me figure out why this movie had become a hit. It was marketed as a comedy, but I certainly wasn't laughing. It wasn't until much later that I learned why My Big Fat Greek Wedding resonated with so many. When asked what the appeal of the movie was, a lot of people gave responses like, "I married a Greek woman and her family was exactly like this," or "I am a child of immigrants and my family was exactly like this." But since I was not a child of immigrants nor married to one, most of the movie's humor went completely over my head. Watching the film today, the only thing that really makes me laugh is how the father is constantly ascribing Greek origins to words that obviously aren't Greek, like kimono, and that's because this kind of pseudo-linguistics is something I've seen from turbo-nationalist types. So, with all that said, what is the context of these "I hate my wife" jokes? Before we go any further, I should point out that humor about hating your spouse did not originate with the boomer generation. Henny Youngman, famous for his "Take my wife, please" line, was born in 1906, but we can find similar jokes going back even further. In Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, the prologue to the Wife of Bath's tale references a joke about a man who complains to his friend about how his last 3 wives all hung themselves from a tree in his garden, to which his friend replies, "Pray, sir, give me a cutting from this miraculous tree." And the context for this sort of humor is that, for much of human history, marriage was an obligation, and there was a tremendous amount of social pressure on men and women to get married. Far from being a mere legal arrangement, marriage was seen as a sacred promise made before God. In the Gospel of Mark, it is written, "But from the beginning of creation God made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. And they twain shall be one flesh, so then they are no more twain but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." Marriages were often arranged by one's parents, and while children could and did refuse these arrangements, doing so was often considered a grave insult. This attitude can still be found in parts of the world today, the most extreme example being honor killings, where a woman who rejects an arranged marriage is considered to have brought dishonor upon her family, and who is then killed to restore that honor. Throughout history, women have faced numerous restrictions on their ability to own property and to make a living independent of men. In Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice, the Bennet estate is entailed on a male heir, but since Mr. Bennet has only daughters, his death will cause his children to become homeless. Naturally, this provides ample motivation for protagonist Elizabeth Bennet to find a husband. You may have heard that women in the United States could not open a bank account or obtain a credit card until 1974. This isn't quite true. They could obtain them prior to then, but banks were permitted to deny credit card applications on the basis of things like race or gender or marital status. It was not until the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 that these forms of discrimination became illegal. Prior to that, it was entirely within a bank's power to decide that women couldn't be trusted with a credit card, or that they should require a male co-signer before they could acquire one. And if you found yourself in an unhappy marriage, it wasn't always easy to get out of it. Today, people in countries like Canada and the United States enjoy no-fault divorce, where neither party needs to prove any sort of wrongdoing to terminate a marriage. In Canada, no-fault divorce was first introduced with a 1986 amendment to the Divorce Act of 1968, and in the United States, California was the first state to allow no-fault divorce with the Family Law Act, which was signed into law by Governor Ronald Reagan in 1969, with most states following suit in the decades to come. Before that, divorce required some sort of legal grounds to proceed, such as cruelty, infidelity, or mental illness. Laws on divorce varied from state to state, and in fiction, there's a largely forgotten cliché about people traveling to Reno, Nevada to get a divorce, as the state of Nevada had much laxer divorce laws than other parts of the country. But even without legal barriers, getting divorced carried with it a considerable stigma, one that hasn't quite gone away. I remember, as a child, mentioning the possibility that I might get divorced one day to my mom, who sternly responded with, "When you're caught, you're caught." Setting aside how strange it is to equate marriage with being caught, as if some woman were laying a trap for me somewhere, the message was clear. Marriage is for life, and only bad people get divorced. Lastly, let us consider the average age at which the boomer generation married. According to the United States Census, during the 60s and 70s, when boomers came of age and started finding spouses, the median age for men was around 23, and for women, it was around 21. And remember, this is the median age, which means that half of those ages are going to be lower. Now, think back to what kind of person you were back in your early 20s. Chances are you thought you had the whole world figured out and were confidently wrong about a whole lot of things. At that age, a lot of people are still trying to figure out who they are as individuals, and they can change an awful lot during this period as they settle into their careers and figure out what they want to do with their lives. How many people married someone in their early 20s in the expectation that they would never change, only to find out that they were someone completely different when they hit 30? So, to sum up, you had a generation that was pressured into marrying young and which faced numerous legal and social obstacles to divorce. It's easy to imagine then that a lot of boomers wound up in unhappy marriages, and for them, joking about it was a means of coping. Because a joke is seldom just a joke. It often carries with it a deep and enduring pain. The laughter is simply there to ease that pain. And in my own personal experience, the boomer generation has never had much in the way of what we would call emotional intelligence. Simply put, they aren't interested in examining their own feelings and have even less interest in the feelings of others. This is why I'm always annoyed when people call Hank Hill autistic, when in reality, his behavior is hardly out of the norm for his generational cohort. Him being uptight, closed off, emotionally constipated, and having a low-key resentment that the world he grew up in no longer exists is an absolutely bang-on depiction of your average boomer male. For people of that generation, if you were unhappy with your life, then you didn't talk about it or go to therapy. No, you bottled that stuff up inside, doubly so if you were a man. The problem is, communication is important to any relationship, married or not, and being unwilling or unable to communicate when you're unhappy isn't going to lead to happiness in the long term. And while it may sound judgmental or presumptuous of me, the impression I get of the boomer generation is that they are a people who lived in a way that made them miserable and resent younger generations for not wanting to partake in that same misery. And those younger generations do not face the same pressure to find a spouse, and when they do, it's at an older age. Combined with the fact that women no longer require a man to earn a living, and the prevalence of no-fault divorce laws, younger people are less likely to wind up trapped in unhappy marriages, and their responses to the old jokes about hating your wife are usually along the lines of, "Then why did you marry her then?" Ultimately, humor is often ephemeral, a classic case of "you had to be there." Seinfeld was one of the biggest TV shows in the 90s, often described as a show about nothing, and in many ways, the 90s was a decade about nothing. The West's old foe, the Soviet Union, had been defeated, and while it may have been a time of material prosperity, there was also a kind of aimlessness to it. With the threat of nuclear annihilation greatly diminished, people busy themselves with the Gulf War or the Monica Lewinsky scandal or the dot-com bubble, and films and TV shows like Beavis and Butthead or The Big Lebowski often tapped into that sense of nihilism and aimlessness. But what seemed edgy, transgressive, or provocative back then might very well be baffling and incomprehensible to the younger folks of today. And the reverse is often true. It's easy for us millennials to look down on things like Skibbity Toilet as an example of a Gen Alpha brain rot, but did we all just forget about being children ourselves and thinking that toilets were something inherently funny? Do we not remember the hand-wringing of concerned parents everywhere who insisted that TV and violent video games were rotting our brains? But now I'm rambling. Thanks for watching, everyone.